there last night. Every night, the world's farmers must feed 216,000 more people, 80 million per year. It is becoming more difficult for the world's farmers to keep pace with this growth in demand. But beyond that, we now also have rising affluence. There are probably at least 2 billion, maybe close to 3 billion now, who want to move up the food chain, consuming more grain-intensive meat, milk, and eggs. This also takes more grain. And then the third source of growing demand for grain in the world is to fuel cars. In the United States last year, we harvested 415 million tons of grain, the world's largest grain harvest. Of that, 1.6 million tons is going to ethanol distilleries to produce fuel for cars. What this means is that the world price of grain is now tied to the price of oil because we can convert grain in effect into oil, i.e. ethanol to fuel cars. So as the price of oil goes up, and all the projections are that oil prices will rise in the years ahead, whether it's from Deutsche Bank or Goldman Sachs or the World Bank or whatever, oil prices are going to go up. And the price of grain is now tied to the price of oil because if the food value of grain is less than the fuel value, the market will move the grain from the food economy into the fuel economy, into the energy economy. And I don't think that even many of the world's economists have yet figured out that the price of grain is now tied to the price of oil. On the supply side, I want to talk about three things. One is falling water tables. The second is melting ice sheets and rising sea level. The third is melting mountain glaciers and the effect on the flow of major rivers. Water tables are now falling as a result of overpumping in countries that contain half the world's people. And these include the big three grain producers: China, India, and the United States. As the demand for food has increased, so has the demand for irrigation water. Farmers in India, for example, have drilled 21 million irrigation wells. They are now pumping water faster than aquifers can recharge, so water tables are falling. In effect, overpumping, whether it's in India or China or Saudi Arabia or Mexico, means that we are increasing food production with irrigation in the short run in an inflated way, not in a sustainable way. Because if you overpump, then eventually you will deplete the aquifers and the rate of pumping will necessarily be reduced to the rate of aquifer recharge. So in effect, we're creating food bubble economies that will be bursting at some point in the years ahead. And again, I don't think we've yet quite grasped what overpumping is about. One dramatic example would be Saudi Arabia. The Saudis have been self-sufficient in wheat production for more than 20 years. And they have done this by tapping an aquifer. It's about a kilometer down. It's very deep. It's a fossil aquifer. It does not recharge. So when it's gone, it's gone. And the Saudis announced 2 years ago that that aquifer was largely depleted. Their wheat production, which was nearly 3 million tons in 2007, in 2010 will be about 700,000 tons. So their grain harvest has dropped by more than 2/3 in 3 years, and we estimate that by 2012, the wells will virtually all be dry, and there will no longer be any wheat production in Saudi Arabia. Now, this is a small country, so it alone is not going to dramatically alter world grain markets. But it is an example of what happens, a particularly dramatic example of what happens when food bubbles start to burst. Melting ice sheets. The Greenland ice sheet is melting, and it is melting at an accelerating rate. If it were to melt entirely, sea level would rise by 7 meters. The West Antarctic ice sheet is breaking up. If it breaks up entirely, sea level rises by 5 meters. Now, neither of these is going to happen overnight. But the latest projections are that during this century, sea level could rise by up to 2 meters. Even a 1 meter rise in sea level would inundate half of the rice land in Bangladesh. And there's a World Bank map on this. A 1 meter rise in sea level would put a good part of the Mekong Delta in Vietnam underwater. The Mekong Delta produces half the rice in Vietnam. Vietnam is the world's #2 rice exporter after Thailand. There are another 19 or so rice-growing river deltas in Asia that would be affected in varying degrees by a 1 meter rise in sea level. What is to me so interesting about this is that ice melting on a large island in the far North Atlantic can shrink the grain harvest of Asia, where half the world's people live. We are now living in a very complex world in the interaction between natural systems, the climate system, and the economy, food production. The other ice melting trend that is of growing concern is the melting of the glaciers, is the melting of mountain glaciers. Of most concern is the melting of the glaciers in the Himalayas and on the Tibetan Plateau, because it is the ice melt from these glaciers that sustains the major rivers of Asia and the surface irrigation systems that depend on them. The rivers are the Indus, the Ganges, the Mekong, the Yangtze River, the Yellow River. China is the world's #1 producer of wheat. India is #2. The United States is #3. With rice, China and India totally dominate the world rice harvest. What happens to the glaciers in the Himalayas and on the Tibetan Plateau will affect food prices for the entire world. We have never seen such a massive projected threat to future food security as we now see with the melting of the Himalayan and Tibetan glaciers. Thus far, I've been talking mostly